what we observed while we were analyzing these stand-up routines, 52 stand-up routines, was that there is a recurring pattern of techniques that these stand-up comedians employ. So they downplay, they overlook, they ridicule, they trivialize. So quite a lot of routines, you will see that you'll see Kunal Kamra saying Hindu khatre mein nahi hai, logic khatre mein hai. So what is this? This is trivialization. This they work to dismiss the genuine concerns faced by the Hindu community in present day India. So what can be the consequences of this kind of humor? As Sir was rightly pointing out, this may instill fear and apprehension towards Hindus, and this can rob their humanity and dignity. We can definitely debate the immediate consequences of these jokes, and there is a wonderful article by Minhas Merchant about this. And we can also debate about the long-term implications of Hinduphobic pop culture, not just stand-up comedy, because these are far-reaching concerns. So, but this can definitely foster gradual disillusionment among Hindus with regard to their own traditions, a sense of disregard, a sense of self-loathing or self-pity. And our findings suggest that this research can serve as a valuable framework for analyzing other pop culture portrayals of Hindus and Hinduism in television, films, advertisement, memes. I think a very good extension of such a study would be studying anti-Hindu memes and social media content. So the power of humor is immense. It can uplift, unite, and bring joy, but it can also perpetuate stereotypes. It can erode identities and fuel prejudice. Through this study, we shed light on Hinduphobia in Indian stand up comedy, and we aimed to initiate a crucial conversation that encourages sensitivity, empathy, and understanding in our increasingly diverse and interconnected world. If you want to bring down a nation without firing a single bullet, dilute their culture, tradition, and history, thus orchestrating the society's destruction from within. So, today, as we reflect on our findings post 2 years of doing this research, we recognize the immense impact of stand up comedy as a cultural force, or for that matter, any form of pop culture is a very strong cultural force. It has the power to shape opinions, alter perspectives, and influence societal norms. And we know that with great power comes great responsibility. So, a nation is only strong as its cultural fabric, and that is why this attention, this study deserves the platform and deserves lot more and more people should probably consume pop culture content with that kind of cognizance, awareness, and sensibility.
Namaste. Indic Talks welcomes you, which is being organized by the Center for Indic Studies in Indus University. I am very happy to talk about the title of our session today, which is the representation of Hindus and Hinduism in Indian stand-up comedy. This talk will examine the complex relationship between humor and religion through the prism of Indian stand-up comedy and its representation of Hindus and Hinduism. This particular talk will be delivered by Professor Ramesh Rao ji, who is a professor of communication studies at Columbus State University, having worked in India briefly as a bank officer, a school teacher, and a copy editor for a major newspaper. He earned a PhD in communication from Michigan State University. He is the editor of the very famous India Facts as well. We also have our co-speaker today, Dr. Nidhi Shendurnikar ji, who is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Journalism and Communication, the Maharaja Sayaji Rao University of Baroda. She has close to a decade of teaching and research experience in media and communication studies. She is interested in research and teaching of Indic perspectives. This particular research has also been aided by Avinash Brahmabhat and Rutvi Datani ji, who I also warmly welcome. And I request the speakers to take over from here.
Namaste, everyone, and thank you, Ojasviji, for the warm welcome and the introduction. As all of you know, this was a team effort. So, my co-author, Rutvi Dattani, will begin the talk. I will take it forward, and the concluding remarks will be offered by Professor Ramesh Rao, and he'll also address the Q&A session. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you and hope it will be a fruitful session. So let's begin. Great, Rutvi, over to you.
Sure, ma'am. Namaste, everyone, and thank you so much for the warm welcome and the introduction, Ojasviji. We feel pleased and elated to be sharing the findings of our research with Center for Indic Studies today. So let me offer an introduction to what this research has been about. Although modern stand-up comedy finds its origins in the early vaudeville theater of the United States, it has now become one of the most popular art forms that shapes political discourses and narratives around the world. So in light of the relationship shared between humor and religion, one that is full of political undertones, we examine the projection of Hindus and Hinduism in 52 stand-up comedy routines in India. Initially, the study was conceived as a student project in the Maharaja Sayajirao University of Baroda in the year 2020, and later it was transformed into a full-fledged academic pursuit by a team of four. So that is Professor Rao, Dr. Shendunikar, Avinash, and myself. And then we went on to present the paper at the International Society of Media, Religion and Culture Conference in Germany in August this year. Today, I will be discussing the history and evolution of humor in the Indian as well as the Western socio-cultural context. And Dr. Nidhi and Professor Rao will be discussing the results, the data and the data analysis of the study. Avinash will not be presenting today since he's occupied with work, but he will stay connected with us throughout the discussion. So the Sanskrit word hasya, which stands for joy, laughter, and humor, is one of the 9 rasas, one of the 9 emotions in Bharat Muni's Natya Shastra, an ancient Hindu text on drama, theatre, and performing arts. Natya Shastra is estimated to have been composed around 500 years before Common Era and holds that theater and performance are democratizing spaces where conversations take place. So humor was evoked in the Indian traditional theater as a predominant emotion by the use and display of unusual jewelry, deranged clothing, impudence, and incoherent speech. Both humor and the use of comic effects have been important ingredients of the Hindu theater and the Hindu storytelling culture, which is also something that present day Indian stand-up comedians have been acknowledging in their interviews. So author Lee Siegel, in his book Comic Tradition in India, writes about how he is startled to look at India's ability and courage to laugh at itself and embrace humor as a cultural phenomenon. But present-day Indian comedians take a cue from American comedians because of how Western pop culture has shaped beliefs and attitudes over the years. So the beginnings of stand-up comedy routines can be traced in the US vaudeville theater in the late 19th century. The first person to simply stand up and tell jokes without any accompanying distractions was Frank Fay, who was known for advocating anti-Semitism through his jokes in the year 1970. This makes us realize that increasingly the role of humor was seen to be beyond offering entertainment, and present day comedy challenges hegemonic ideas, challenges and questions the status quo. It questions stigma and superstitions and is deeply connected with social justice and the themes of political activism. Uh, One of the instances of the same would be the Monty Python group of comedians who poked fun at the British monarchy and the Vatican Pope with the use of satire and dark humor, and were still met with positive and good spirit. But humor targeted at religion has not always received the same treatment from different quarters of the society. Uh, for example, the banning of the novel Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie for invoking and using satire against Islam was considered blasphemy. Similarly, a 2012 BBC sitcom, Citizen Khan, invited the issuance of hundreds of fatwas for offending religious sentiments. And recently in 2015, the controversy against the Charlie Hebdo magazine for the depiction of Prophet Muhammad invited terror attacks, and which resulted in 12 people being gunned down and more than 11 people being injured. Now, if we particularly look at the Indian stand-up comedy scene, a 2015 Being Indian report says that comedy in earlier times was prominently used as a filler in music shows and stage performances, and comedians did not command the fame and respect that is being accorded to them now. So Indian TV did have a number of shows that gained popularity because of its witty and relatable humor. But contemporary Indian stand-up comedy is known to have started with Veer Das performing at smaller clubs in the United States, and then becoming one of the most recognized stand-up comedians in English. So the Indian stand-up comedy landscape has now transformed from being just a scene or an art form to becoming an industry with its commercial value. It has also positioned itself as a resistance and an anti-establishment space, especially with the rise of Bharatiya Janata Party in 2014, and comedians gaining prominence due to their takes on religion include Veer Das, Kunal Kamra, Uruj Ashfaq, Saurabh Pant, Tanmay Bhatt, among others. Consequently, prominent themes in Indian stand-up routines are religious intolerance, majoritarianism, and the otherization of minorities. So, from the standpoint of its relationship with religion, Indian stand-up comedy is being called out for its verbosity and disproportionate, biased, and hypocritical treatment meted out to Hindus and Hindu gods, as well as the Hindu way of life. And that is where the question arises: that is Indian stand-up comedy normalizing Hindu phobia? And by Hindu phobia, I mean the irrational attacks on Hindus, the hatred that is spread against Hindus, the denigration, the demonization, and the dehumanizing treatment meted out to Hindus. So while the word was initially used in the year 1986, it has now been more prominent with the academic scholar Rajiv Malhotra using it. And it is also interesting to note how various forces have contributed to Hindu phobia. So initially, the invasion of Islamic forces, later colonization and imperialism, and finally the nature of Indian state post-independence have all contributed to rising Hindu phobia and hatred against Hindus. We shall now look at the process as to how the research was carried out. This slide represents what typical Hindu phobia looks like. What are the tropes that are usually used to spread hatred against Hindus or to target Hindus from the Western framework. So these are the research questions that the study addressed. We tried to understand the stance of Indian stand-up comedians on religion, the nature and slant of humor on religion, what is the nature of jokes, what kind of narratives and commentaries were popularized, is Indian stand-up comedy Hindu-phobic or not, and what are the techniques and tropes that are used to poke fun at Hindus. These are again the technical aspects. So if anybody wants to have a look at this, we opted for a qualitative and exploratory form of research because of the paucity of past research and literature that was available on stand-up comedy and the study of Hindus and Hinduism in India. So for the sampling process, we used the inclusion-exclusion criteria, where we first came up with a repository of 122 stand-up acts. And using the inclusion-exclusion criteria, we finalized 52 stand-up acts, which was our final data, and was analyzed to study the depiction of Hindus. We also we referred, and our study has been based on the coding framework provided by Professor Vamsi Juluri, which assesses the presence of Hindu phobia in various media formats. So the theoretical and conceptual framework that examines Hindu phobia from a media studies perspective. There are several categories provided and different codes for each framework. And our data was analyzed using this framework and the categorization that has been provided by Professor Juluri. My co-presenter, Dr. Shendu Nikar, will be discussing each of these categories in detail and what did the analysis look like.
Thank you so much, Rutvi, for offering this very useful backdrop. So now that we have understood the historical context in which the global stand-up comedy landscape, as well as the Indian stand-up comedy landscape is located, and we have articulated the purpose of our research and also shared with you how we went about the process of looking at the representation of Hindus and Hinduism in the Indian stand-up comedy landscape. I will take you through the very significant findings of how stand-up comedy in Hindi and English, as far as the Indian stand-up comedy landscape is concerned, projects Hindus and Hinduism based on the 52 stand-up routines that we analyzed from a time period of 2015 to 2021. Just waiting for my slide to move. Yeah. So broadly, if we speak of the stance that stand-up comedians take on religion, our analysis reveals that religion is not at all a taboo topic in the Indian stand-up scenario. Stand-up comedians in India, they frequently engage with religious issues and they make explicit references to religious traditions, customs, rituals, symbols, and religious icons. So in dealing with religion, Indian stand-up comedians are open, upfront, and explicit. However, while they do so, and especially when they are generating humor about Hindus and Hinduism, they posit themselves as social reformers and promoters of liberal and egalitarian values. They question religious practices, in this case, Hindu religious practices, and they posit themselves as people who, by doing so, are trying to educate their audience about democracy and secularism. The delivery of humorous content about religion in general and jokes on Hindus and Hinduism in particular is done both subtly and explicitly. We'll see in detail what are the kinds of jokes that we see on Hindus and Hinduism. So when stand-up comedians joke on Hindus and Hinduism, they use some broad techniques. First is they make very generic and broad statements on religion, specifically on Hindus and Hinduism. Second, they present the Hindu religion as irrational or devoid of logic. So they joke about religious practices, but they joke in such a way that the message that comes across to the audiences is that Hinduism is an irrational religion and the practices in the Hindu fold are devoid of logic. Third, in joking on Hinduism, they focus on certain individuals. So, for example, certain saints, certain popular Hindu icons and figures, particular Hindu religious practices, particular castes and communities. And while doing so, they borrow heavily from the mainstream media discourse on Hinduism. So, if you look at how mainstream media in this country, in India, talks about Hinduism, if you study the mainstream media's representation of Hinduism, and if you look at the stand-up discourse on Hinduism, it's the same, because stand-up comedy in India borrows a lot from mainstream media when they are joking on Hinduism. And they not just borrow from this mainstream media discourse, they also try to legitimize it. In many ways, these jokes on Hindus and Hinduism place religion in a very context devoid situation, and it doesn't allow audiences to look at counter views. It also ignores a lot of nuance, complexity, and layered ideas that come with the practice and philosophy of Hinduism. Stand-up comedians, when they do a stand-up routine around Hindu issues, they also use a technique called familiarity. They understand what their audience's knowledge on Hinduism uh, and they try to build up on this knowledge. So, for example, if they know that their audience is aware about the concept of Sat Feras in Hindu marriages, they try to build up on this knowledge, and their jokes are constructed around these concepts. And finally, there is very little counter view that is offered in Indian stand-up comedy as far as the positive role of religion in the Indian social and cultural context is concerned. So a lot of the positioning of Hinduism in Indian stand-up comedy is negative, and stand-up comedians completely overlook that religion plays a very important role in the Indian landscape, and religion offers a lot of understanding. Religion is a very important framework, and Hindus in particular and Indians in general look at the role of religion in their life very positively. So when we look at what are the aspects about Hinduism that these jokes are based on. So typically in Indian stand-up routines, you will find jokes on Hindu beliefs like karma, Gaumutra having medicinal benefits. You will find a lot of jokes on Hindu deities, Ganesha, Lord Ram, Lord Shiva, Lord Hanuman, and others. You will find jokes on Hindu rituals such as Sat Feras, the ritual of Muhurat, mantra chanting, many other sacred rituals performed by Hindus during birth and death. Then you will also find jokes on popular Hindu festivals like Diwali, Karwa Chauth, Navratri, Uttarayan. There are also jokes on Hindu symbols like the Gayatri Mantra, Janeu, temples, yoga, Sanskrit, saffron-colored flag, etc. You also find jokes on iconic Hindu personalities who have a very important role to play in Hindu history, like Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, Baba Ramdev in the contemporary context, our Pandits and our Pujaris. Uh, Jokes can also be found on Hindu history, but from a very different vantage point. So there are references to the ethnic cleansing of Hindus from Kashmir, the desecration of temples forced conversions, love jihad, etc. Jokes are also found on Hindu knowledge traditions like Jyotish Shastra, Ayurveda, Vastu Shastra. These jokes peculiarly target Hindu practices like the caste system, dowry practice, sati, warding of the evil eye, nazarutarna, and the reverence for cow that is commonly found among Hindus. And lastly, we found that so this was not one category and code in Professor Juluri's framework, but we just added it based on the analysis that we carried out. Hinduism's relationship with other faiths also comes across very prominently in these stand-up routines. So the relationship that Hinduism has with other monotheistic faiths specifically is an important and recurrent theme in these stand-up routines. So let's move on to the narratives that are popularized in jokes on Hindus and Hinduism. I'll quickly run you through this because I want to be able to use time to share some very concrete examples from the stand-up acts that were a part of our sample. So you can see that in the first category that we find in Professor Juluri's framework, which is bias, 83% of stand-up routines from our sample contain jokes that amounted to mistranslation, denigration of Hindu symbols and icons, and cultural appropriation of Hindu practices. In the second category, which is colonial tropes, you can see 62% of jokes either erase or mock the Hindu view of history. In the third category, that is Hinduphobic colonial tropes, you can see 83% of jokes are about idol worship, insult to deities, distortion of symbols, festivals, religious and cultural practices in Hinduism. And 44% of stand-up routines project Hindus as people who lack self-control, are driven by irrational actions, superstition, and are over-emotional. And in the final category, which is contemporary neo-colonial Hinduphobic tropes, propaganda against Hindus and Hinduism, dehumanization of Hindus and Hinduism, and demonization tactics were found to be very prominent in 40% of stand-up acts from the sample that is 52 acts. And it is quite interesting to note that as my co-presenter Rutvi pointed out right in the beginning, especially post-2014 with the shift in India's political landscape, stand-up comedians use a lot of political undertones and political references to target Hindus in their jokes. So they make mocking and denigrating references to supporters of the Bharatiya Janata Party, RSS, and to Prime Minister Modi. And by doing this, their discourse is targeted against Hindus and Hinduism. I will now move to the final part of our talk where we'll be discussing some examples from these stand-up routines to understand the prominent tropes that are employed by these stand-up comedians in their in the humor that they generate on Hindus and Hinduism. So even though there are a lot of examples to be shared from the different categories in the coding framework, but we'll stick to the top 5. So we have taken the most prominent 5 tropes that emerged from the analysis, and I'll try to present examples only with respect to these 5 tropes. So as you can see, 83% of stand-up acts, in 83% of stand-up acts, we find mistranslation, denigration of symbols and icons, and cultural appropriation. So, for example, in one stand-up act, an Indian female comedian labeled the followers of the ISKCON tradition as porn addicts, simply because the name ISKCON rhymes with the word porn. This joke relies on a misinformed connection and perpetuates a negative stereotype about Hinduism and its believers. In Gone Wrong or Hinduism by Disney, a well-known Indian American comedian, in this case, Veer Das, who identifies as an atheist, jokes about Lord Ganesh, who is one of the most revered deities in Hinduism. Lord Ganesh is worshipped as the remover of obstacles, and his distinctive feature is an elephant head. The comedian attempts to mock Lord Ganesh's elephant head by referring to it as plastic surgery gone wrong or Hinduism by Disney. This joke trivializes an integral aspect of Hindu belief and can be disrespectful to those who hold Lord Ganesh in high regard. Continuing with these examples, the second most prominent trope was insult to deities, again found in 83% stand-up routines. So in one joke, a comedian compares the Hanuman Chalisa to an ineffective antiseptic. Now we know that the Hanuman Chalisa is one of the most sacred Hindu prayers recited daily by half a billion people in India. And in the context of this joke, it is important to consider whether the pursuit of a few laughs outweighs the religious sentiments of millions of Hindus. In another example, the comedian makes sexualized references to Hindu goddesses, Mata Parvati. And it is worth noting that among the major religions in the world, Hinduism stands out for its worship of female deities and the recognition of feminine divinity. In a very repetitive trope that we found in these stand-up routines, the construction of the Ram Mandir in Ayodhya is mocked and it is equated to a fun park. And the tagline that the comedians popularize is Ram Lalla aayenge, Imagica yahi banayenge, which is like a take on the Mandir yahi banayenge stance that Hindus have had for a long time. In another prominent trope, the erasure or mocking of the Hindu views of history was found in 62% of stand-up acts. So one example is where a comedian is equating Hindu scriptures to Wikipedia, and in doing so, she is diminishing the depth and richness of our sacred texts. This comparison not only undermines the vastness of Hindu texts, but also questions their accuracy because we don't rely on Wikipedia. In another example, there's a comedian who is referring to Hinduism or Hindu polytheism as Hinduism is Avengers, thereby mocking the belief in multiple deities and likening multiple Hindu gods to multiple comic book characters. And this is done to trivialize the profound significance of polytheistic worship in Hinduism. In another prominent trope, which is lack of self-control, irrational action, Hindus as superstitious people, which was found in 44% stand-up routines, a female comedian uses Karwa Chauth to convey that Hinduism as a religion has not evolved because Hindu women observe the auspicious fasting tradition of Karwa Chauth. She labels the Karwa Chauth practice as irrational and superstitious. And here we should note that fasting is not a practice peculiar to Hinduism only. It's a religious and spiritual practice in major religions worldwide, but she calls out this practice as irrational when it comes to Hindus. In another example, and in quite a lot of stand-up routines, we find the mention of beef. We find mocking references being made to cow worship. So in this particular routine, stand-up routine, the comedian tries to say that not eating beef makes Hindus unprogressive because towards the end of the stand-up act, he says that because Hindus revere the cow so much, probably there'll be a day in India that there'll be only cows in India. So again, here we need to recognize that dietary preferences, both as a matter of choice and those based on religion, spiritual, moral, or cultural beliefs, they exist worldwide, not just in Hinduism. But here in this stand-up routine, the comedian makes it a point to single out Hindus as uncool or irrational for not consuming beef or for speaking out against the consumption of beef. Finally, in the trope that focuses on propaganda, dehumanization, and demonization, we see that 40% acts used these techniques of propaganda, dehumanization, and demonization to generate humor on Hindus and Hinduism. To give you just two examples, in one stand-up routine, Rajputs are referred to as unproductive and Brahmins are referred to as people who don't have brains. Then Jai Mata Di is called an unscientific chant because in this stand-up routine, the stand-up comedian is narrating an apocalyptic comic story, but he refers to this particular chant as unscientific. He tries to say that this is just an illogical expression and it's not going to save you during the time of a calamity. So yes, we can debate about the scientificity of all religious chants, but this can be seen as propaganda because this is aimed at portraying Hindus who rely on chanting during challenging periods as an irrational act. Lastly, in most stand-up comedy routines, which take support of generating humor through a description and explanation of communal violence in India, we see that there is a deliberate attempt to ignore Hindu victims in religious conflict, and comedians refrain from highlighting the experiences of Hindus in religious conflict. So doing so paints an incomplete and biased picture which tries to demonize Hindus and portrays them as oppressors in a communal situation where they are not the victims but only the oppressors, and the relationship that they share with other faiths is of the oppressor and the victim, which Ruthvi rightly pointed out that that a lot of stand-up talk about, very subtly talk about Hindu majoritarianism. From here, I request Professor Rao to conclude our talk, and we'll be very happy to address the questions that you may have for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Nidhi. Thanks, Ritvi, for setting this up for me. And thanks to all the people who are gathered this morning, this evening, wherever you are, from whichever part of the world. So thank you for being here. My talk will be more impromptu. Maybe I have earned this right to speak off the top of my head because I have been teaching now for the last 40 years. Okay, so given that, we can ask this question, so what? Why did we do this? What is the rationale? What is the importance of this particular inquiry? Why now? And so on. Okay, and I think that is as it should be, because in every study that we do in not just higher education, but in any pursuit of knowledge, the question always is, so what? Why? Okay. Here, I think it is very important to kind of look at this from a larger context, because when the kind of political, social, cultural playing fields are not level, then there is a concern about if there is any kind of targeting of groups, and especially in every democratic society, the concern is about targeting minorities. So here it is very interesting to see this kind of punching up, socking into the jaw of Hindus who are considered, perceived as the majority, who have social and societal and cultural and political dominance in the country. And you know what? I think you should be able to take it. And that is fine too, because we Hindus are not devoid of humor. I think, if we look at our gods, our deities, call them whatever, we clothe them, we bathe them, we feed them, we, in fact, even mock them, we challenge them, because Hinduism is not merely a matter of faith, but it's a pursuit of knowledge. It is something that is part of the core values, if you could call it so. And therefore, the question, especially when there is conflict in society, as we have seen, and when there is increased conflict, and when there are these kind of anecdotal information, these people are really targeting these people, we need to, as scholars, as educators, to kind of find out, say, is this really true? Is this what is happening? So from anecdotal kind of information about Indian stand-up comedy or Indian films, Indian music, or whatever, we wanted to look really at the data, as any good scholar would do. What does the data tell us? Okay. So this is what we have found, and this is what Nidhi and Ritvi have set up for me. So the question is, what is happening and what did we find? We found this constant repeated reference to Hindus and Hinduism in a very derogatory, dismissive manner. This constant, this kind of punching ball, as it were, not just Hinduism as some kind of an abstract religious thing, but Hindus, and the deities and the gods and the values being constantly challenged, mocked, dismissed, sought to be demonized. That becomes an interesting, observation about society. And more interestingly, in these times of conflict, is hate of a particular kind being ignored, even normalized, saying, oh, they deserve it. So who deserves it and why is also an interesting question. And then, what is it about Hindus? Are we supposed to be such a group that anything passes, and that we are willing to be targets of whatever, simply because, we come from this grand tradition where we accept everything under the sun? This kind of generalizations that, in the lived daily lives, does not make sense. Okay. So Nidhi, if you can go to the next slide, please. So here again, I don't want to be repeating, but this is what we have found, that it is given, and this is something that I have written about, that we mention in many of our India Facts articles, comparatively. Christianity is practiced in about, or let me put it this way, there are about 110 Christian majority countries in the world, out of the 193 or 94 members of the United Nations. There are about 50 Muslim majority countries in the world. And surely, while we Hindus, the Hindu diaspora is spread around the world, Hinduism is the majority faith, religion, pursued, in a couple of countries, maybe Nepal and India. So it is interesting how then, therefore, these kinds of representations of Hindus and Hinduism will have the kinds of effects that we should be concerned about, or at least be reporting about. Okay. So, and again, Nidhi has pointed this out, that uh, Hindu traditions, practices are somehow old-fashioned, but obscurant. That it is a barrier to progress, barrier to development, and so on. In some ways, we could even go back to what people have been referring to about the Nehruvian ideal of making roads and dams and electricity the new temples of India, and so on. Uh, so sorry about that. And that we Hindus, or Hinduism, is a representation, that of irrationality, that there is pseudoscience. And of course, there are surely in society, there are people who make all kinds of claims. But then to take out one or two and then kind of generalize it to the larger population is problematic. And kind of this is very interesting, that Hindus are presented as aggressive, as hardliners, that we have some kind of an expansionist agenda. If that were so, surely I think, while Hinduism, in fact, did travel early on, as we can see in Southeast Asia, Hinduism is not traveled that much these past few centuries. And then Hinduism and Hindus are also seen as oppressive of women, oppressive of minorities, whoever the minorities could be, even though they are majority in the world. We are also presented as deceitful, intolerant, and so on, which is an interesting combination of a variety of features, characteristics used to basically target Hindus and Hinduism. If you can go to the next slide, please. I think I'll skip number one. Go to the second thing about consequences. We can use a variety of D words here. Deracination. A lot, especially in terms of the younger generation. There is this distancing of themselves from their traditions, from their values, from their families, and so on. There is a distancing from quote unquote rituals, which people forget. Ritual is discipline. It is not merely blind ritual. From ritual comes discipline, and from discipline comes ritual, as someone astutely observed recently. We also forget, based on this kind of constant, repetitive kind of presentation of Hindus and Hinduism, that it has real life consequences in terms of violence. We have seen that the killing of monks, the targeting of priests, the cutting of the Janivars in Tamil Nadu, of priests, and a deliberate attempt to kind of make people disenchanted with their own traditions, cultures, beliefs, and practices. So given this, again, in the context that we are not against, humor, that we indeed come from a tradition that has celebrated humor, we need to say, okay, now that we have gathered some data, now that we have analyzed this, now that we have kind of come to certain kinds of conclusions about what all this means, we can say, okay, so what next? It's an opportunity for those scholars gathered today to kind of look at this and say, you know what, I see a lot of holes in your methodology. You have kind of ignored some of the literature already in this field. There's an opportunity to take this forward. We could study other pop culture forms. I mean, there is some study done on films, on movies, and surely my good friend and colleague, Professor Jaluri, on whose work we have based this work on, has done work on Bollywood, on films. So it would be, and films are easier to study than stand-up comedy. So there is potentially that, opportunity for people. Study other pop cultural forms, and in different languages. Oh my goodness. We come we come from a very rich tradition of languages. What, we have 22 official languages. So there is, and this is where I think it can be very rich to see how in Indian stand-up comedy there is bilingual, trilingual, four language kinds of puns. Okay, and just recently I was looking at some Kannada comedians, and especially this wonderful young woman, who has this thing called Ayyo Shraddha, and how she uses, language, Kannada, Tulu, English, Tamil, everything to come up with fascinating, wonderful humor. So we could study some of those kinds of things. And of course, as I said, any methodological issues, sampling, especially in these kinds of studies, can be a problem. We can look at actually, saying, okay, we heard this, we saw this. Can we really find out what actually these comedians themselves are thinking about these when they present this? So can we talk to them? Can we interview them? Can we do some more, careful analysis about contexting what they are presenting? So this is where we are at now. We have had a lot of, I would say, fun doing this, even though it took almost about 2 years to complete this. We have had a wonderful time presenting this in Germany this past August. This opportunity once again offers us another platform to share what we have done, and hopefully soon we can have a journal article that can be shared among scholars and others who are interested in studying these things more systematically. Okay, with that, I think I am about wrapped up here, and I will just ask Nidhi and Ritvi if they have anything to add before we can go on to the Q&A.
Yes, so just to offer a very brief closure, what we observed while we were analyzing these stand-up routines, 52 stand-up routines, was that there is a recurring pattern of techniques that these stand-up comedians employ. So they downplay, they overlook, they ridicule, they trivialize. So in quite a lot of routines, you will see that you'll see Kunal Kamra saying, Hindu khatre mein nahi hai, logic khatre mein hai. So what is this? This is trivialization. They work to dismiss the genuine concerns faced by the Hindu community in present day India. So what can be the consequences of this kind of humor, as Sir was rightly pointing out? This may instill fear and apprehension towards Hindus, and this can rob their humanity and dignity. We can definitely debate the immediate consequences of these jokes, and there is a wonderful article by Minhaz Merchant about this. And we can also debate about the long-term implications of Hinduphobic pop culture, not just stand-up comedy, because these are far-reaching concerns. But this can definitely foster gradual disillusionment among Hindus with regard to their own traditions, a sense of disregard, a sense of self-loathing or self-pity. And our findings suggest that this research can serve as a valuable framework for analyzing other pop culture portrayals of Hindus and Hinduism in television, films, advertisement, memes. I think a very good extension of such a study would be studying anti-Hindu memes and social media content. So the power of humor is immense. It can uplift, unite, and bring joy, but it can also perpetuate stereotypes. It can erode identities and fuel prejudice. Through this study, we shed light on Hinduphobia in Indian stand-up comedy, and we aimed to initiate a crucial conversation that encourages sensitivity, empathy, and understanding in our increasingly diverse and interconnected world. So to end with a profound quote by Colonel Den, if you want to bring down a nation without firing a single bullet, dilute their culture, tradition, and history, thus orchestrating the society's destruction from within. So today, as we reflect on our findings post 2 years of doing this research, we recognize the immense impact of stand-up comedy as a cultural force, or for that matter, any form of pop culture is a very strong cultural force. It has the power to shape opinions, alter perspectives, and influence societal norms. And we know that with great power comes great responsibility. So a nation is only strong as its cultural fabric, and that is why this attention, this study deserves the platform and deserves lot more and more people should probably consume pop culture content with that kind of cognizance, awareness, and sensibility. With that, I thank Ojasvi ji at the Center for Indic Studies, Indus University, for this platform. Also, thank you to all our participants, and thank you to my co-presenters, Professor Rao, Rutvi Dattani, and Avinash Brahmbhatt, who's in Odisha today, and he's not able to join us in that sense, but he's with us. So thank you, and we are really grateful for your patient hearing.
Very well, that brings us to the end of the lecture part of it. And now we shall open the floor to the audience. As the question answer session begins, I would like to do the Shri Ganesh of the questions because I have one. We had these comedy media houses that had started initially. And being of the younger generation, that is what marked the beginning of this comedy consumption, so to say, whether it was AIB or it was Shids and Giggles and all of that. And that have come to an end, right? Those companies have closed down. And I think that has begun something even more dangerous, which is this brand making, like an individual person becomes a brand, and there's a force of people who are supporting them on social media. So we have Munawar Faruqi for that matter, we have Veer Das for that matter. I mean, this brand making is becoming even more stronger with the aid of Bollywood in their contemporary efforts on OTT. Even if you look at Tamil comedians who may be doing this comedy sets with a mixture of Tamil, other southern Indian languages, as well as English, like Karthik Kumar, they foster a lot of separatism among the north and the south. And this individual brand has taken up so much that now we have a president of Ukraine also who is a comedian. So from a legal point of view, how are we to battle this particular slandering that we see on a daily basis through comedy sets? Because there are institutional apologies that are extended on a daily basis when it comes to the offense which is taken from the Christians, or the offense that may be taken by the Muslims. But how exactly, as an institution, as a people, do we counter this from a legal point of view?
If I may, very quick response, and I think we have to be careful here because speech has been free, should be free, but I have written a paper on speech traditions in ancient India. They say, speech should be free, but then it is the responsibilities on the speaker to make careful choice. Okay, because once we go the route of, or as we say here in the US, route of legal, kind of decisions on what we should consider as correct speech, as that which is prohibited, that which is free, then it's a slippery slope. Who is going to decide? And therefore, I think it is, again, free speech absolutists, as some of my friends are. I think they are right in some way, but we should also be cautious about where that could lead if there are not enough barriers to speech that provokes violence, that provokes separatism, that provokes demonization. And so that is something that maybe those of us who have the power, the influence to keep talking about it and to be cautioning about it. And as we know, in India, actually, there are maybe a lot more legal, recourses that people take. Just this morning, I saw Abhijit Majumdar's post on X saying, he's been called by the Tamil Nadu police again. So there is that thing. So yes, it is a very important question, and I think it is something that literally, books can be written about it. But I would, as an individual, as a scholar, say, look, let society be open, but let us exercise. If we are to progress as a species, as the human species, we should learn, because otherwise, that kind of conflict basically can lead us to that kind of terrible conflict where we all suffer.
Oh, yeah, if I may just intervene, sorry for taking away everybody's attention, but I just want to acknowledge Professor Dr. Neeti Chopra. She's with us in the meeting. She's the Dean of our faculty, Journalism and Communication at the Maharaja Sayajirao University of Baroda. And this study was thoroughly made possible because of the ambient academic environment provided by ma'am. So thank you, ma'am, and thank you for joining. Yeah, I think we can continue with the questions.
We have a question by Shikharji. He's saying, thank you for the presentation. My question is regarding the parameters used to classify the joke as offensive or neutral or supportive towards Hinduism. For instance, the comparison of the Hindu pantheon to Avengers may not come across as offensive to some Hindus. So how is it possible to define a clear-cut, unequivocal criteria to assess a joke as offensive or neutral or supportive?
Okay, so I'll quickly offer a brief response, and if Ruthvi wants to add, she can. Typically, if I speak of this particular study, we really haven't classified a joke as offensive or neutral because we have a methodological and conceptual framework. We have just tried to understand the nature of these jokes. We have tried to understand what are the themes and topics about which these jokes pertaining to Hinduism are made and under what different categories we can put them. And this has been done based on an already available framework by Professor Juluri, who's done quite extensive studies and research into the representation of Hindus and Hinduism in the media. But of course, I totally understand where you're coming from, because this categorization of whether a joke is offensive or not can be really subjective. This, I believe, merits a different kind of a study where we try and understand what jokes. So we could not do an audience survey or do expert interviews, but I think reaching out to other stakeholders in the stand-up comedy landscape and going and talking to young people or people who consume stand-up comedy content would be the correct way to understand whether this joke is offensive or not offensive. But even though we don't have the means to assess it at this moment, we may try and say that the core cultural beliefs and values of the Hindu way of life, if they are targeted, if they are attacked, then it can be regarded as offensive, because when it comes to religion and representation in media and pop culture, we understand that there are some very core values that we try not to hurt sentiments with respect to that. And that becomes the yardstick, that becomes the parameter for assessing whether any content or speech is offensive, hateful, bigoted, or not. So definitely these standards may vary, but a good way to find this out is actually using quantifiable techniques, trying and measuring the content, trying and looking at different parameters, and then trying and finding out whether it was offensive or not. So in my limited opinion, we didn't really try to do in this study, because this was like a first step to understanding what is the nature of jokes on Hindus and Hinduism. And we'd really be happy if someone can take it forward. In the Western context, there are a lot of studies using quantitative techniques. So those techniques can really help us find how this content is being received.
Quickly, I think this is fairly simple also. And I think maybe Nidhi, Prithvi, and Avinash might have done a little bit of intercoder reliability here,
Yes.
looking at stuff. That is a very simple thing that we can, not only do it, especially since we are a group of scholars working on this, that intercoder reliability is a very good way to kind of figure out, a range, from offensive to least offensive kind of stuff. So
I'd like to add something to respond to the question. I think when we speak about comparisons made, or when a joke that states that compares that Hindu gods are are seen as Marvel characters or Avengers. I think it's not always about the literal meaning of the joke, but more so also about the tonality and the essence of the joke. So when you start drawing parallels between Hindu gods and comic characters or animated characters, what are you trying to reduce the religion to? So that is also one question and understanding of how these jokes are framed and catered to the audiences. So one of the jokes in the stand-up comedy acts that we analyzed was that Hindu scriptures are like Wikipedia pages. So now we realize that Wikipedia pages do not have credibility, is what the dominant understanding is, and that is how these jokes are catered to the audiences. So it might not be offensive on the face, but then it is more about questioning, or it is more about questioning the credibility of Hinduism and Hindu scriptures. And then it is also reinforcing the stereotypes that Hindu gods or Hinduism is mythology. So it has not existed in reality, but it is a myth. So same way how Marvel characters or Avengers is a myth, Hinduism is also a myth, and there is no concrete evidence about the existence of Hinduism. So which is also when the way West targets Hindus with a very shallow understanding of our our history and our civilization. A similar framework is employed by Indian stand up comedians to look at Hinduism. And I think that is when we categorize these jokes in a certain way and identify the tropes that are being used to target Hindus.
Okay. So thank you. Indus University, I have watched your talks before also. Duncan Jelke's and Sufia Pathan's works, now they have come out as books. So thank you for organizing this. And my question really is about, when Nidhi ji was referring to the different kinds of tropes, I was reminded of a book by David Spur called The Rhetoric of the Empire, in which, there are 11 classifications of the kind of tropes that has originated from the from colonial times to depict India, and particularly, I mean, whenever you are depicting Bharat, I mean, Hinduism or Sanatan Dharma is never far. So among them, debasement is obviously one, then aestheticization, eroticization is another one, negation is another one. So I thought that this, I mean, to me it appears that this stand-up comedy trying to debase and negate Sanatan Dharma is a continuation of what has been happening since the colonial times. And it's precisely because of the fact that these people or these stand-up comics, they are also trying to, or their audience is also very westernized. I mean, you will not have this sort of an thing happening, let's say in a tier 2 city or a tier 3 city, or or a town. I mean, because generally people will be drinking beer and laughing at themselves primarily, and thinking how westernized and secular they are. So that's I think that's a comment which I it's more of a comment, and it's also, in Edward Said's work, Orientalism, I think it's also flows into that. But secondly, and what bothers me really is, how do you? I mean, this is great work that's being done, but no journals, will try to publish this, and unfortunately. India continues to be dependent on journals that are published from the West, and we know who the editors are, which universities they sit in. So, over the last 10 years, there's been a lot of talk, debate that has been happening. But what is the way to, go out there, create those journals, disseminate our ideas, so that, some things can also change in the university space? So the first was a comment, the second was a question.
Yeah, let me quickly respond. And thanks for that citation, for that reference, Arunodai. Really, I think you add to the conversation here, and it's important, therefore, for us to kind of follow up on that. And as to journals, and I think there is a lot of uh, new things that are happening. There are people who are kind of keen on expanding the Indian academic space, the Indian media space, which again has been mostly catering to or even pandering to Western audiences. But it's also true that when we say Western, it is also what we can simply say the left liberal side. So here in the US, for example, or in Europe, for example, you see that clash, the left-right clash, which then that particular kind of framework is now foisted upon India. Therefore, you see the kind of a crude classification of left and right. So there are all of those kinds of things that we should be concerned about. But yes, those Indian journals, that really look for rigor, discipline, care in writing, in doing the work. I hope there are more of those, and we will try to continue and find a way, a platform for us to publish this article and to kind of get the wonderful responses that we are getting today.
I would request Ashwini ji to go ahead and ask that question, please.
Hi, Dr. Nidhi and others. It was a wonderful session. And this is something very new that I saw on Indian stand-up comedy. My question is to Professor Rao. This is not basically on Indian stand-up comedy, but it is my own work that I'm doing on analyzing the tweets of Indian politicians. And in my results, I've seen a lot of polarization in their tweets. As policymakers, they themselves indulge in polarizing conversations. So my question is, as academician or a research scholar, what can I recommend in my study towards this scenario?
Very important observation, Ashwini. It's not just politicians. We now see academics who are whose tweets are provocative. We have journalists whose tweets are provocative. Social media has merely exacerbated these divisions, where social influencers, whatever category of social influence that they belong to, have a larger than life role in our lives. So it is something that people who created these platforms don't have an answer to. And of course, governments are trying to. Of course, Europe and now in the US, and during the COVID times, there were attempts to basically censor certain kinds of speakers, information, and some of the best scientists were censored. Uh, so, under the guise of, that they were spreading disinformation and so on. It can work both ways. So we can have authoritarian governments that can really control speech, just like the Chinese do, or the Iranians do, or any kind of authoritarian, system does. Um, so really, I think finally it becomes a matter of how technology gets abused, misused, and what kinds of guardrails can we as individuals and as scholars can offer people. And I think that is very important, because right now it's a kind of a free for all out there. And in the best of worlds, where people try to control speech, you really don't know who ends up controlling your speech.
Hina ji, please go ahead.
Okay, it's a little, I'm not be able to frame my question properly. It's a very nice presentation, and I'm interested in this subject. But isn't there a basic question to ask as to why have we been so enslaved mentally, intellectually by the West? Isn't there the other religion? You'll find that children know about their own religion, they practice them, but Hindu families don't do it. We look down upon our own selves. We in the families itself do not have that kind of culture or the atmosphere to be able to react to things when we are criticized. Like they bring up something negative about us, and we're not able to say, okay, this is the answer. We feel ashamed of ourselves. One example I'll just give. I remember it was long ago. It was, I'm already 77. As a kid in school, the first time I read the word pagan, that Indians are pagans, was the sentence in the history of whatever book it was. And I felt ashamed of it. Why have we got this mental setup? And should we find out why it started? Why did we become slaves? We were slaves, yes. We have been enslaved mentally, intellectually. But the question to ask is why? I don't know if anybody has an answer to that.
It's a very big question with layers of, surely colonization, Indian history can account for most of this. Yeah, it is something that historians, opinion writers have kind of probed. After all, we are speaking in English today. If at all, we are talking of colonization. So there are many layers for this. It's an interesting question, and I think it should constantly be raised in our families, but also in our own lives. So what is it that I am doing, and what is it that I'm not doing? If indeed I am so concerned about my values, my culture, my civilizational history. What is it that I'm reading? What is it that I'm practicing? Those are questions that I think each one of us should be asking ourselves, because the larger question is much more difficult to deal with, as to why we are at this stage. We are an old civilization. We go back, tens of thousands of years. So there's a lot of things that we have accrued over millennia.
I think that brings us to the end of the question answer session. Thank you very much to all the speakers that we've had. It has been a truly enriching and insightful session, and your study helps in facilitating and substantiating our beliefs of the growing Hindu phobia that is being catered through the pop culture that is seeming to be consumed by Indians more and more in number. We hope to have many such talks with you. Thank you very much. Namaste.